My younger brother sold my sports car and gambled away every penny, losing it all, including my car. When I confronted him, he confessed with a smirk, then slapped me and threw me out of the house. Furious and humiliated, I swore revenge. But the next morning, he woke up to a shocking surprise waiting for him, something that would change his life forever. He never saw it coming. My name is Barbara, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the responsible one in my family. It wasn't a role I chose, but rather one I seemed destined to fill. I grew up in a small suburban town with my parents and younger brother, Tom. Our home wasn't extravagant, but it was comfortable, with a backyard where Tom and I used to play as kids. Those early days were simpler, but as we grew older, the cracks in our family began to show, and I became all too aware of where I stood in their eyes. From a young age, I worked hard at everything I did. School, chores, savings, you name it, I was always the diligent one. I had dreams of building a stable, fulfilling life and knew the only way to get there was through dedication and effort. Tom, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. While I saved every penny for things I truly needed, like a laptop for school, Tom would spend whatever he could get his hands on. Even as a teenager, he was reckless, always chasing thrills. At first, it was small things like blowing his allowance on arcade games or flashy sneakers, but it didn't take long for his spending to spiral out of control. Despite our stark differences, my parents doted on Tom. He was their golden boy, and they never seemed to notice, or care, how much trouble he caused. When Tom barely scraped through high school, my parents celebrated his graduation as though he had topped his class. Meanwhile, when I earned a scholarship to college after months of hard work and sleepless nights, their response was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, Barbara," Mom had said, already turning her attention to Tom's latest antics. It hurt, but I'd grown used to it. I told myself that their favoritism wouldn't matter once I built the life I wanted. So I worked harder. College was my escape. It was the first time I felt truly seen for who I was, someone capable, determined, and ambitious. I excelled in my studies and landed a corporate job right after graduation. I started saving immediately, first for an apartment and then for a car. Both milestones were significant for me, symbols of my independence and hard work. But while I was striving to build my future, Tom was doing everything he could to avoid responsibility. He dropped out of college within a year, claiming it wasn't for him. Instead of finding a job or figuring out what he wanted to do, he spent his time gambling at local casinos. My parents never held him accountable. When he blew through his savings, they gave him more. "He just needs some time to figure things out," Dad would say whenever I tried to bring it up. Things finally came to a head one evening when I returned home from work to find my car missing. At first, I thought it had been stolen. My heart pounded as I called the police to report it, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. When I told my parents what had happened, they exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing. That's when Tom stumbled through the front door, drunk and disheveled. "Tom," I snapped, rushing toward him. "Do you know where my car is?" He looked at me with glassy eyes and laughed bitterly. "Yeah," he slurred. "I lost it." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "What do you mean you lost it?" I asked, my voice rising. Tom sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "The casino," he muttered. I played poker. Lost all my money, so I sold the car to keep playing. But I lost that too." I stared at him, stunned. "You sold my cars?" I said, my voice trembling with anger. "How could you do this to me?" Before Tom could respond, Mom stepped in. "Barbara, calm down," she said, her tone dismissive. "It's just a car. You can always buy another one." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It's not just a car," I shouted. "It's mine. I worked for it, I saved for it, and he had no right." "Enough," Dad barked. "Don't yell at your brother. He made a mistake, and he said he's sorry. Let it go. Let it go." I was seething. My parents didn't seem to care about what I had lost, only about protecting Tom. The tension in the room grew unbearable, and then, out of nowhere, Tom staggered to his feet and slapped me across the face. I stumbled back, more shocked than hurt. "You're always so perfect," he spat. "Always judging me." My parents didn't say a word. Instead, Mom turned to me and said coldly, "Barbara, maybe you should leave. You're upsetting him." I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. My family, the people who were supposed to support me, had betrayed me in the worst way. It felt like I was losing everything, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. I left home that night with a suitcase in one hand, and my heart shattered into pieces. My own brother had sold my car, a car I worked so hard to buy, and instead of defending me, my parents sided with him. As I walked away, their words echoed in my head. "Don't upset him. You can always buy another car." It wasn't just about the car, though. It was about everything that led to this moment. The years of favoritism, their constant dismissal of my efforts, and the way they enabled Tom's reckless behavior. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed somewhere to go, and the first person I thought of was my best friend, Laura. Laura had been my rock for years, the one person who always had my back. She was a lawyer, sharp and compassionate, and I knew she would understand. When I showed up at her apartment with tears streaming down my face, she didn't hesitate. "Barbara, come in," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. I told her everything, how Tom had secretly taken my car, sold it at the casino, and returned home drunk, unapologetic. I told her about the slap, the way my parents defended him, and how they had told me to leave. She listened quietly, her expression growing darker with every word. "This isn't right," she said firmly when I finished. "You've been putting up with their nonsense for too long. It's time to stand up for yourself." "I don't even know where to start," I admitted, feeling utterly lost. "You start by holding Tom accountable," she said. "He had no right to take your car, let alone sell it. You can take legal action." The thought of going to court against my own brother felt like a betrayal in itself. But hadn't they already betrayed me? My parents' favoritism, their refusal to see Tom's flaws, and their complete disregard for my feelings had left me with no other choice. Laura reassured me that I wasn't alone. "We'll do this together," she promised. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and preparation. Laura helped me file a police report for the theft of my car and drafted the legal documents to take Tom to court. It felt surreal, sitting in her office, recounting every detail of what had happened. I was nervous, but I also felt a flicker of determination. For the first time in my life, I was standing up for myself. When the court summons arrived at my parents' house, all hell broke loose. My phone rang incessantly, first my mom, then my dad, and finally Tom. I didn't answer any of their calls. I couldn't. I wasn't ready to face them yet. Instead, I stayed with Laura, who continued to support me every step of the way. A few days later, my parents showed up at Laura's apartment. They were furious. "How could you do this to your own brother?" Mom demanded as soon as I opened the door. "How could he do this to me?" I shot back. "He stole my car, sold it, and spent the money gambling. And you're defending him." "He made a mistake," Dad said, his voice tight. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Blowing it out of proportion?" I repeated, incredulous. "He slapped me. He kicked me out of the house. And you stood there and did nothing." Mom's face softened, but her words didn't match her expression. "Barbara, we're family. Families forgive each other. Then why haven't you forgiven me for not being Tom?" I snapped. The words came out before I could stop them, but I didn't regret them. For years, I had been holding back, pretending their favoritism didn't hurt, but I couldn't do it anymore. They left without resolving anything, and I knew that our relationship might never recover. But I also knew I couldn't back down. This wasn't just about the car. It was about all the years I had been ignored and dismissed, all the times my achievements had been overshadowed by Tom's mistakes. I deserved justice, and I was going to fight for it. The day of the court hearing came faster than I expected. I was a bundle of nerves as Laura and I walked into the courtroom. Tom was already there, looking smug and unconcerned. My parents sat beside him, glaring at me like I was the villain in this story. It hurt, seeing them choose him over me yet again, but I kept my head high. The proceedings were grueling. Laura presented the evidence, the police report, witness statements, and even security footage from the casino showing Tom arriving in my car and leaving without it. Tom tried to defend himself, claiming he was drunk and didn't know what he was doing, but the judge wasn't swayed. When the verdict was announced, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The judge found Tom guilty of theft and financial misconduct, sentencing him to community service and mandatory counseling for his gambling addiction. He was also ordered to repay the value of my car, though I knew that would take years. After the hearing, my parents approached me one last time. "Barbara, please," Mom begged. "Drop the case. Forgive your brother. He's learned his lesson." I looked at her, then at Tom, who refused to meet my gaze. "You've spent his whole life forgiving him," I said quietly. "Maybe it's time he learns what it means to take responsibility." And with that, I walked away. It wasn't easy, turning my back on my family, but I knew it was the right thing to do. For the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Walking out of that courtroom was one of the hardest things I've ever done. As much as I wanted justice, part of me had still hoped for some kind of resolution, a moment where my parents or even Tom would see how much they had hurt me. But as I left, their cold stares and Tom's defiance made it clear they weren't ready to change. For years, I had lived in their shadow, their expectations, and their neglect. Now, I was determined to leave all of it behind and start fresh. Laura, my best friend and lawyer, was waiting for me outside the courthouse. "You did great in there," she said, giving my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I don't feel great," I admitted. My victory felt hollow. Winning the case wouldn't undo the years of hurt or magically make my family care about me. Still, it was a step forward, a way to reclaim something they had taken from me. "You'll feel better in time," Laura said. "This is just the beginning." And she was right. Over the next few weeks, I poured myself into rebuilding my life. I moved out of Laura's guest room and into a small but cozy apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. I decorated it piece by piece, choosing furniture and colors that made me feel happy and at peace. Each new addition was a small victory, a reminder that I was creating a life on my own terms. Work became my sanctuary. I threw myself into my job with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to keep moving forward. My boss noticed my dedication and started assigning me more challenging projects. The extra work kept my mind occupied and helped me gain confidence. I was proving to myself that I could thrive without my family's approval, and that realization was both empowering and bittersweet. During this time, Laura introduced me to someone, Jake. He was one of her friends from college, kind and easygoing in a way that made me feel instantly comfortable. At first, I was hesitant to let anyone new into my life. I was still reeling from everything that had happened with my family, and I wasn't sure I was ready to trust again. But Jake was patient, never pushing me to share more than I was comfortable with. Slowly, he became a steady presence in my life, someone who saw me for who I truly was. One evening, Jake and I were having dinner when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mom. I hadn't heard from her since the trial, and my heart sank as I read the words, "We need to talk. Please come home." Against my better judgment, I decided to go. Part of me wanted closure, even though I knew better than to expect it. When I arrived at my parents' house, it felt like stepping into a time capsule. Everything looked the same, but it felt different, smaller, colder. My mom was waiting for me in the living room, her face lined with worry. "Barbara," she said, her voice heavy. "We miss you." I wanted to believe her, but the words felt hollow. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. She hesitated before saying, "Your brother is struggling. He's been having a hard time since the trial. He's trying to turn his life around, but he needs help." I stared at her, incredulous. "You're asking me to help him? After everything he's done to me?" "He's your brother," she said, as if that explained everything. "Families are supposed to stick together." I shook my head, the anger bubbling up inside me. Families are supposed to support each other, not tear each other down. Where was this loyalty when he sold my car? When he slapped me? When you both stood by and let it happen? My dad walked in then, his expression stern. Barbara, we don't want to fight. We just want to move past this. Move past it, I repeated. You mean sweep it under the rug, like you've always done with Tom's mistakes? No, I'm done being the one who pays for his actions. They didn't say anything after that, and I left without looking back. I felt lighter as I drove back to my apartment. For years, I had been chasing their approval, hoping they would see me for who I was. But now, I realized I didn't need their validation. I had found people who valued me for me, friends like Laura and Jake who stood by me no matter what. As the weeks turned into months, my life began to stabilize. Jake and I grew closer, and I felt more at ease than I had in years. He encouraged me to pursue things I loved outside of work, like painting and hiking. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. One day, Jake surprised me with tickets to a local art exhibit. As we walked through the gallery, admiring the vibrant paintings and sculptures, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't known before. This was my life now, a life I had built with my own strength and the support of people who truly cared about me. But just when I thought the past was behind me, it found a way to creep back in. One evening, as Jake and I were making dinner, I got another message from my mom. We're losing the house. Please help us. I stared at the screen, torn between anger and pity. The people who had pushed me away were now asking for my help. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over yet. The message from my mother, we're losing the house. Please help us, stared back at me as I stood in my kitchen. Jake, sensing something was wrong, walked over and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. What's going on? He asked gently. I handed him my phone, and he read the message with a furrowed brow. After everything they've done to you, they're asking for help now. His voice was calm, but I could hear the disbelief behind it. I sighed, setting my phone down on the counter. I don't know what to do, Jake. A part of me wants to ignore them, but another part of me feels like maybe I should go. It's still my family. Jake looked at me for a moment, then said, whatever you decide, I'll support you. But just remember, you've worked so hard to move on from the pain they caused. Don't let them pull you back into it unless you're sure it's what you want. The next day, I went to their house. It wasn't out of obligation or guilt, but because I needed closure. I had to face them one last time. Not for their sake, but for my own. When I arrived, the house looked different. Less like the home I had grown up in, and more like a shell of what it once was. The lawn was overgrown, the paint was peeling, and there was an air of neglect that mirrored the state of our family. Mom greeted me at the door, her face etched with worry. Barbara, thank you for coming, she said, her voice soft. She led me inside, where Dad was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. Tom was nowhere to be seen. We didn't know who else to turn to, Mom began, wringing her hands. The court fees, the debt from the car, and other things have piled up. We can't keep up with the mortgage payments anymore. I crossed my arms, my tone colder than I intended. What about Tom? Shouldn't he be helping you? Mom glanced away and Dad muttered, he's gone. Gone. I repeated, my voice rising. What do you mean, gone? He left, Dad said bitterly. Packed up his things and disappeared a few weeks ago. We don't even know where he is. I felt a strange mix of anger and vindication. After everything, Tom had abandoned them, just like I knew he would. He had always relied on their unconditional support, and now, when they needed him the most, he wasn't there. I should have felt sorry for them, but all I felt was exhaustion. And now you're asking me to fix this, I said, my voice steady. After years of dismissing me, ignoring me, and enabling Tom, you expect me to clean up the mess he left behind? Barbara, please, Mom said, tears welling in her eyes. We made mistakes, but we're still your parents. We're family. I shook my head, the weight of their words pressing down on me. You always used family as an excuse to forgive Tom, no matter what he did. But what about me? Where was your loyalty when he sold my car? When he slapped me? When you kicked me out of the house? They didn't have an answer, just silence. For years, I had craved their validation, their acknowledgement, but standing there in that moment, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I had built the life without them, A life filled with love, respect, and peace. They had chosen Tom over me time and time again, and now they were facing the consequences of that choice. I can't help you, I said finally, my voice firm but not unkind. I've spent my whole life trying to earn your approval, but I'm done. You need to figure this out on your own. Mom sobbed quietly as I turned to leave, and Dad didn't say a word. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of relief, as though I was finally shedding the weight of their expectations and disappointments. It was painful, but it was also liberating. Back at my apartment, Jake was waiting for me. When I walked in, he pulled me into a hug. "How did it go?" he asked. "I told them no," I said, my voice steady. "They're on their own now." Jake nodded, his arms still wrapped around me. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. In the months that followed, I focused on building the life I had always dreamed of. Jake and I moved in together, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. I threw myself into work, earning another promotion, and picked up hobbies that brought me joy, painting, hiking, and even taking cooking classes with Jake. My apartment became a home filled with love and laughter, a far cry from the toxic environment I had left behind. As for my family, I didn't hear from them again. Occasionally, I wondered what had become of them, if they had managed to save the house, if Tom had ever come back, but those thoughts became less frequent as time went on. They were part of my past, a chapter one had closed. One evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunset, Jake joined me, holding 2 glasses of wine. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. The journey hadn't been easy. It had been filled with pain, betrayal, and heartbreak. But in the end, I had found something far more valuable, myself. For the first time, I was free, and I knew I had made the right choice.